There comes a point when you realize the game hasn't changed. You have. The legs don't recover the same. The mistakes cost a little more. But to compete, it's still there. The love of the game of hockey is still there. You just have to adjust. This is Shift Change, staying in the game at 50 plus. If you opened my hockey bag from 40 years ago, next to my bag today, you almost wouldn't recognize it as the same sport. Hey everybody, welcome back to Shift Change. Today, I'm going to go through my hockey bag, item by item, on what I used to use and what I use now, and why it's changed. There's one practical. If you're an older player thinking about upgrading your gear, this is for you. The first thing I want to talk about are the skates, because in my opinion, that's one of the biggest things that have changed and made the game different. Because back in the 80s, I used to wear the CCM Tacks. Everybody wanted the CCM Tacks when I was a kid. It seemed like it was the most popular brand. There also was a Bauer, and eventually I did go to Bauer. But I remember the skates being just a steel blade, a full leather boot, and not a lot of structure to it. And I remember breaking them in was always the hardest part. You'd get a new pair of skates, and it seemed like it would take half the season to break in the skate. There was always the, if you soak them in the tub and then put them on wet and tighten them up, that they'd kind of mold to your foot that way. But we didn't get the structure and the support that we get out of skates today. And I remember when Gretzky came in the league, he was wearing the Daust, D-A-U-S-T, the Daust or Daou. And Gretzky had a leather boot, but he also had those blue blades. And boy, did I want those blue blades. But the skates also rotted away. And if you used them enough and you played enough, the rivets would rot and the skate would get dry rotted. But then they came out with the clear tuck blade or the toque blade, however you pronounce it. And that was something I had to have. And I remember all the guys on my team had them when we were just, 10 or 11 years old. And they were great, but then they were breaking when a puck hit them. They would crack, and then the rivets would rust, and the rust would run down the clear part of the blade. So they were really cool looking, and they were basically changed hockey skates at that point. But when I look at my skates today, I wear the Bauer Hyperlights, and they are an amazing skate. They're super light, they're molded, they're heated up for a custom fit right away. Much lighter is the key. They have a better forward flex for stride and efficiency. The holder and the blade systems for swapping out the steel is absolutely amazing. And you don't even have to take your skate in to get it sharpened. I use 2 sets of blades, and I just take the blades in, they throw it on the Sparks machine, and they sharpen them up. That's the amazing part. Today, your skate goes dull during a game, no problem. You pop out the blade, you slop a new one in, and you're ready to go. So I think when you look at skates, there's really no comparison. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the old-fashioned brown leather skate. It's what we grew up with. It's what we know. But the skates have changed immensely today. The second thing that I think is probably one of the biggest changes in hockey is the stick. Wood versus composite, or even aluminum. But when we were kids, I remember going to the hockey store and picking a Northland stick out of a bucket for $10. And then my dad and I would take that stick home and we would put it in a vise and we'd shave down the edges on the shaft and we'd shape the stick the way we wanted it. We'd put it over the stove and we would curve it the way we wanted to, put it under a door and bend that stick up to give us the biggest curve we could get. Now, back then, curves were illegal and you had to be careful, but I remember either boiling water and heating it over the steam or putting it over the stove and heating it over the flame. The only problem with that is they had fiberglass covers to them and the fiberglass would burn off, which would make the stick weak and it didn't last long. Then they came out with the aluminum stick. And to me, that was the greatest thing to ever happen. Gretzky came out with a silver one, which is amazing. And they came out with a composite as well. The composite made the game better because the sticks were lighter. The guys could shoot faster. But the problem with the aluminum stick was, after so many months or a year of using it, it would bend the other way, and you'd have to flip it back around so that the bend would go the other way. So the aluminum stick didn't really work. But now they've come out with these composites that are ultra light, many different flexes, And they may break just as easy as the wood, but the advantage is quicker shots, better flex, and lighter, which makes this game much more dangerous. The 80s solid wood with a fiberglass wrap made it heavy, inconsistent flex per stick. Blades were often heated and curved by hand, and they wore out rather than broke. I remember the tips of these things would get all chipped up, and you'd have to keep taping the tip, or it was a pain in the butt. But with today's composite, the construction is dramatically lighter. Its engineered flexes and kick points for specific shot types, far more consistent, but pricier and prone to snapping instead of just wearing down. I mean, we're paying $350 for a stick today. Now, one of the smarter ways to do it is you buy the Pro Stock stick, and you could pay $180 for a Pro Stock. To me, they're better than the sticks that you buy off the rack. I feel like the sticks on the rack are made to be a little tougher to last longer, where the Pro sticks are made lighter to give them more performance, but are more prone to breaking. That's just my opinion. To me, the stick has changed hockey. And a quick, cool story. A buddy of mine used to own the Northland Hockey Company, and when he bought it, he bought the patterns and all of the sticks that were used as patterns for the pros, and he also bought stock that belonged to a lot of the pros back in the 60s and 70s. And I was able to get Gordie Howe's stick and Bobby Hull's stick. And one time I met Bobby Hull at an event, and I brought that stick to show him. And Bobby said, "Yeah, that's my stick, except it needs a little bit of a adjustment." So Bobby Hull took my stick, went into the restaurant's kitchen, turned on the stove, and curved the stick exactly the way he would have curved it when he played. It was an amazing moment. But the stick was custom made for Bobby. The top of it, where your top hand went, was kind of carved out where his hand would have fit. And it was pretty cool. Now, we can't do that with today's sticks. You have to buy the curve the way it is. You can't, sand down or shape the shaft at all, because it's obviously fiberglass. So just interesting the way the sticks were back then versus today. The other thing I want to talk about was my helmet. Now, when I think about helmets, there's safety standards then versus now. 80s helmets, very different from today. Many players in the 80s played without visors. The basic shell and foam construction with less energy absorption. They were looser certification standards with minimal fit adjustments. For me, I wore a CCM helmet as a kid. I might even wore the Northland Cereal Bowl helmet. But as I got older, I started to wear the Jofa helmet, or what we call the Gretzky helmet, which was also worn by like Yari Curry. And I love this helmet because it was lightweight. It looked good. It may not look good to people today, but it looked good. But the helmet had no protection in it. And one of the problems I had throughout my career playing hockey was concussions. And I blame a lot of it on the helmet that I wore. When you look at today's helmet, they're multi-layered, rotational impact foam. Full cages and visors are standard, even in a lot of adult leagues. There's stricter certifications, adjustable fit systems, and there's more focus on that concussion mitigation to try and limit the amount of injuries to our brains. And that's probably the biggest difference. I feel like today's helmet doesn't always feel as good or fit as well as my 1980s Gretzky Jofa style helmet, but I've had fewer concussions in my later years than I did as a younger player. When I talk about hockey pants, and we'll go to this next, hockey pants are very different today than they were in the 80s. The 80s, they were way bulkier, boxier fits with, like heavy felt foam padding. They had limited in hip and thigh mobility. They had the basic suspender systems. But think about that. They build pants now to help you skate better. They're lighter. They have high density foam in them that protects us better. Well, they weigh way less. They also have better ventilation. And one of the biggest things that I loved when pants started to change is the belt system on them. And I wore suspenders as a young kid, but as soon as the pants came out with a belt system, I went to the belt system and I've been using it ever since. I know there's guys that I still skate with that use the suspender system. to me, I just didn't like the feel on my shoulders. So I've never used it. And for pants, they're a good example of gear getting more protective while also getting less restrictive. The opposite trade off you sometimes see elsewhere, like sticks getting lighter but more fragile. And I remember some of the big changes in pants. I remember the insides in the early 80s was a lot of um, cotton fabrics. And, over time that rotted. It smelled horrible. But then they came out with the Cooperall. And I remember the Cooperall being one of the greatest things that ever happened to me as a hockey player. I loved to slip the pads on all at once and put a shell on. And I still wear a shell today and a girdle because I like that feel. But then the Flyers came out with the long Cooperall. And I know I played on some teams that had the long Cooperall, and they always look good. The problem with the long Cooperall was I felt if you fell and you slid on this nylon shell, and it was hard to stop from sliding. The other problem they had with the long Cooperall is they were all black. And when the puck came as a shot from the point, the goalies couldn't pick up pucks or see them through all the black legs. So pants have changed quite a bit. With the emergence of the shell, teams could have 2 or 3 different shell colors, but the protection is way better than it was back then. And I think it's made hockey players much more agile. The next thing I want to talk about are the gloves. And gloves have changed so much over the years as well. When I look back on my 80s gloves, they were big and bulky. They had boxy leather construction, heavy padding that limited most wrist flex and stick feel. I remember the cuffs used to be 3 or 4 inches long on these gloves, and it would go halfway up your arm. There was minimal segmentation, so the whole glove moved as one stiff block. And the problem was the leather would break down, and as it got waterlogged over the season, would get stiff and dry up and curdle. And the gloves didn't make it a whole season. If they did, they were just stiff. And I remember having to spray water on my gloves every time I used them to try and soften them up from them getting dried out over time. But today the gloves are lighter. They're synthetic with very little bit of leather in them at all. The cuff has changed immensely in the new gloves. They're down to maybe 2 inches of a cuff, and there's better range of motion. You can feel the stick better. The foam padding engineered in these is designed to protect without adding bulk. There's better ventilation in them, and the moisture management is so that they don't get heavy or rot as fast. And that's kind of the biggest thing that's changed about gloves. As long as you dry them out, the only thing that's going to wear out is basically the palms. But a lot of stick tape has changed the way our gloves wear. I mean, you can get this thing called lizard skin now, and it's a soft tape that you can put at the top of your stick, then it doesn't wear your gloves out. But I remember wearing gloves, as a peewee or a squirt, and these gloves were massive. They came halfway up my arm. You couldn't move your wrist. It was just incredibly bulky. Moving on to base layers. And what I mean by base layer is the clothes we wear underneath our equipment versus the 80s, even the 90s. It's crazy. We wore cotton undershirts and long johns. I remember literally wearing long johns under my equipment. They would get wet after, they'd be soaked, and you would just throw them in your bag. There was always those guys that you played with that never washed their long johns, and you knew it when they were in the locker room. But they became heavy when they were wet. There was no moisture wicking characteristics about them all. It took forever for them to dry, and if you wore them in between periods, a lot of guys would change that out. Every period, they would change out their base layer. One of the big things I remember, and I always wanted the light blue base layer pants and shirt that the Oilers wear. Like Gretzky wore it, and I always talk about Gretzky because Gretzky was my favorite player growing up, but Gretzky wore the light blue base layers, and I always wanted those. They were the thing to have. But again, no moisture wicking characteristics. But when you look at today's base layers, everything is a synthetic moisture wicking compression gear. And they fit tight, and they've designed ways to make the equipment work with the base layer. Like, and I know in a lot of the shirts, they put a rubber pattern on the elbow so that your elbow pad doesn't slide when you're wearing your base layers. A lot of these clothes are often odor treated, some with built-in padding and recovery-oriented compression. They dry fast enough to reuse the same day, which is unbelievable. And I feel like with the old versus new, my equipment smells way less than it did as a kid. And I remember, when I was back playing in men's league in Buffalo, if you left your equipment in your car overnight after you played, your base layer, your long johns would freeze to a solid block of clothing. So, and they wore out. I remember there's always those guys you played with. They put their base layer on and it was all ripped and torn, but that's what cotton does over time. So kind of gross, but today's stuff is so much better. The next thing I want to talk about are elbow pads. When you look at the elbow pads in the 80s and 90s, they were hard plastic caps over dense foam with minimal articulation at the joint. So they would just shift or dig in when your arm bent fully. They were held on with basic elastic strips that loosened up over a season. And I remember over time that elastic strip would just get stretched out and your elbow pads didn't stay on. But when you look at today's contoured segmented shells that follow the joint through a full range of motion, they got multi-density foam that's lighter, but it absorbs impact better. There's better strap systems and sleeve systems, and some integrated into full arm guard. And these things stay put without cutting off the circulation. And for us older guys, elbow and joint protection is one area where older players especially notice the difference. Next I want to talk about is the shoulder pad. What I used to wear then versus what I wear now. And this is an interesting one because I still wear shoulder pads from the 80s. And they're my favorite shoulder pads. I've actually bought used ones a couple of times because I stay with the same shoulder pad. But the 80s, they were bulky. They were boxy caps and heavy, like floating sternum protection, but mainly for hard contact hockey. They had limited shoulder rotation. They were hot and poorly ventilated. A lot of them were made of cloth and had plastic, inside of them. And again, it always comes down to this: how did they dry? And a lot of shoulder pads rotted and became, just stinky messes. But today, they're much lighter. There's shell and foam construction. There's better ventilation. There's more range of motion for shooting and reaching when you reach your arm out. And it's a wider range of styles now built specifically for non-contact, lower contact adult league players. So looking at my equipment now versus then, I use the Jofa shoulder pads. They're basically a foam chest and back with a molded shoulder, very similar to what a lot of the Europeans used back in the late 80s and early 90s. I like this shoulder pad. It's light enough for me that I still wear every day. The question now is, when you look at the men's leagues, a lot of guys don't wear shoulder pads. And I think a lot of it is because they are a little bit bigger and bulkier now. And a lot of us older guys like that comfort of, not wearing a shoulder pad. For me, I always wear a shoulder pad. I just feel like at my age, at 58 years old, I need that shoulder pad. I'm a big guy at 6'4", and on skates, I'm close to 6'8", or 6'9". I fall easily. Big guys always fall hard. So if I'm falling hard, I want to know if I hit the boards, I'm not blowing a shoulder out or, taking a shoulder injury because of that. So, some guys just choose not to wear it. But the biggest upgrade, or maybe the most overrated upgrade, if I had to pick one that's actually made a difference in my game or made a difference in hockey itself, I would say it's two. It's the sticks and the skates. To me, with structure in our skate, it's also made the skates last longer. Guys can go years without buying a new pair of skates, depending on how often you use them, because they don't really rot. it takes a long time for the rivets to rot in these because they've designed the skates now with holes in the bottom that sweat can work its way through these holes. The materials in them are, again, they're designed to wick sweat away from the skate and not into the fabrics. And again, the other thing is the stick. The stick has changed the way we shoot. Shots are over 105 miles an hour with a slap shot. Guys are making wrist or snap shots over 85 miles per hour, and they're not even putting a lot of energy into them because the stick has kick points and better flex. And you've seen the one-timer become this amazing shot because guys can really torque that blade. When you look at a guy like Tage Thompson, Tage gets so much flex on that stick, the one-timer comes off like a rocket, and it's 105 miles per hour. And I think most of the year last year, Tage had one of the hardest shots throughout the season. So again, I think the stick and the skate are probably the two biggest things that have changed hockey the most since I was a kid. So I guess if you're an older player and you're looking to buy new equipment, I don't think you need to spend money on the most expensive stuff. If you're playing hockey once a week and it's just a pickup, or you're playing at the local rinks, stick and puck hour skate, I don't think you need to go out and have the most expensive equipment out there. You can buy the mid-range kind of senior level skates, sticks, equipment, because I think they're all so good and made to be and have better performance than you had when you were younger. I think anything you buy today versus what you used as a kid is going to be way better. So that's just my recommendation. So that's about all I had today on equipment. I just wanted to talk about then versus now, because a lot of times in the locker room, we always bring up, hey, I used to use this or I used to use that. And it's always a conversation that is really good with everybody. So if you've got any stories about equipment that you've used that you like or don't like, leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. So thanks for joining me today. Remember, give us a like, share. If you know an older hockey player that would like to listen to Shift Change, let them know. If you've got some interesting stories, I'd love to hear them. Thanks, have a good day, and we'll talk to you soon.